The stage lights were bright, and the studio buzzed with quiet tension. Piers Morgan's show was known for being bold, even aggressive. But tonight, something felt different. The guest's Prince Harry sat calmly across from Piers, dressed in a dark suit, his hands folded, his jaw firm. He had been warned not to come. His team had urged him to cancel. But Harry had made up his mind. He would speak his truth no matter the setting. The audience clapped as the cameras rolled. Piers welcomed viewers with his usual confidence and charm. He smiled, leaned back, and introduced the Duke of Sussex. Tonight, we have a man who has left one of the world's most powerful families to find his own voice. Please welcome Prince Harry. Harry smiled politely and nodded. Thank you for having me. The first few minutes were easy. Piers asked about the Invictus Games, Harry's work with veterans, and mental health programs. Harry answered thoughtfully, talking about how sports helped wounded soldiers heal, how purpose gave them strength. The crowd responded warmly, but in the control room, something shifted. One producer leaned toward another and whispered, "He's skipping the script. He's not going soft." On stage, Piers's smile began to change. He leaned forward just slightly, eyes narrowing. "Now, Harry, many people admire what you've done. But some wonder, are you using your trauma for publicity? You've stepped back from royal life, but you're everywhere. Netflix, books, interviews. Is this healing or Hollywood?" There was a pause. Harry didn't look angry, but the edge in his eyes was clear. "Telling my story isn't a crime," he said softly. The audience went quiet. A few people murmured. Piers raised an eyebrow. "Of course," he said quickly, "but don't you think the public gets confused? One minute you say you want privacy. The next, you're in a multi-part documentary." Harry straightened in his chair. "Privacy means choice," he said. "It doesn't mean silence." The control room grew tense. The producers watched closely. One of them clicked his pen nervously. "It's not going to back down," he muttered. Piers tried to laugh it off. "I suppose everyone needs a platform these days, even royals." Harry didn't smile. "No," he replied, "especially those whose lives were never private to begin with." The camera zoomed in. The tension was thick now, visible. Was no longer a simple talk show moment, which was becoming something else. The live audience sat still, sensing the shift. Piers kept his eyes on Harry. "So you're saying the royal family trapped you?" Harry hesitated, then answered slowly. "I'm saying I was raised in an institution that didn't protect me when it mattered. And now I'm trying to build a life where I can protect others." Piers tilted his head, "And that includes going on talk shows." Harry leaned in just a bit. "Sometimes you have to go where the noise is loudest. That's where the lies live." Backstage, a junior producer picked up his headset. "We need to keep eyes on this," he said. "This could go off the rails." On stage, the lights glared brighter. The air felt tight, heavy. Piers shuffled his notes, then tossed them aside. "All right then," he said. "Let's talk about the Queen." The audience gasped slightly. Harry didn't move, but his face stiffened. Piers had just opened a door, one that Harry knew couldn't be closed again. And the camera didn't blink. The room grew colder, though the lights stayed hot. "Prince?" Harry sat still, but everyone watching could feel the change in his posture. The name of the Queen had shifted the energy completely. Piers Morgan, now more confident, leaned in as if he had been waiting for this moment the entire night. "Let's talk legacy," Piers said. "Your grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, spent her life in service. She never gave interviews, never complained. Don't you think your public attacks on the monarchy dishonor that?" Harry didn't flinch, but he took a moment before responding. "I never attacked her," he said, voice calm but firm. "I loved my grandmother. She represented stability, duty, grace. My decision to speak out wasn't about her. It was about the silence around pain, about protecting my wife, my children." Piers folded his arms. "But you see how that sounds? You're saying the institution caused pain while living in a palace, flying private, and cashing multi-million-dollar media deals. That's not courage. Some would say that's branding. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some viewers scoffed. Others held their breath. I grew up in that system, Harry said. I know what it feels like to walk behind your mother's coffin at 12 years old with the world watching. I know what it feels like to smile through grief. And I know what it means to choose peace over tradition. Piers didn't back down. But tradition built your life. It gave you everything. How can you criticize the very structure that gave you a platform? I didn't ask for a platform, Harry said. I was born on it. A few people in the audience clapped gently. The rest stayed quiet, unsure where the line had been drawn. Piers's eyes narrowed. Let's get real. Isn't it true that since leaving the royal family, your public trust ratings have dropped? That many in the UK now see you as a traitor? Harry nodded. That may be true. But if telling the truth makes me a traitor, then I'll wear that name. I didn't leave because I hated my country. I left because I couldn't protect my family inside that system. Backstage, a red warning light flashed in the control room. One senior producer whispered, "Do we pull it?" Cut to commercial. But the director raised a hand. "Not yet," he said. "This is history." Piers took a breath. His tone sharpened. "You talk about protection. But what about your father? Your brother? You've thrown them under the bus in interviews, books, docustories. No one forced you to say those things. That was you." Harry's jaw tightened. "And what about the years I stayed silent? What about the times I begged for help and was ignored? I tried to do it their way, and it almost destroyed us." The audience grew tense. The silence in the room was louder than any applause. Piers's voice raised slightly. "This show isn't therapy, Harry. It's journalism. People want accountability. And they deserve it," Harry said, now visibly fired up. "But they also deserve truth. Not just headlines, not just gossip." Piers leaned forward. "So tell us, what is the truth, then? Why are you really here tonight?" Harry looked into the camera, not at Piers. "Because people need to know that power unchecked is dangerous. Whether it's in palaces or press rooms." A long pause followed. The control room was dead silent. Then a low murmur began among the audience. Piers stood up. "Do you know what? I've had enough of this self-righteous act." Security tensed. Near the stage, but Harry didn't move. "I didn't come here to act," he said quietly. "I came here because I'm done hiding." And for the first time in the entire segment, Piers looked like the one on the back foot. The silence in the studio was thick. Piers Morgan remained standing, visibly agitated as Prince Harry sat, still composed but clearly steeling himself for what was next. The camera operators exchanged tense glances. Producers backstage whispered frantically, some with headsets on, others glued to live audience reactions across the internet. But Piers wasn't done. He pointed a finger not directly at Harry, but in his direction and said, "Let's stop pretending this is noble. You didn't just walk away from royal duties. You took the family's darkest moments and sold them to Netflix, to publishers. You made your grief profitable." There were gasps. One audience member muttered, "Wow," under their breath. Harry blinked slowly, his jaw setting tight. "You talk like I sold secrets, but I shared my experience, my life. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's because you're used to people staying silent." "Oh, please," Piers scoffed, walking a few steps closer to the audience. "You talk about silence, but since you moved to California, you haven't stopped talking? Oprah, podcasts, memoirs. What's next, Harry? A movie? I'd rather keep talking than let people like you tell my story for me," Harry shot back. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a knife. Backstage, the senior floor director raised a hand to the assistant producers. "Get security ready," he said quietly, "just in case." Piers turned back toward Harry, eyes blazing. You blame the press, you blame the monarchy, you blame your father, your brother. But when do you look in the mirror? When do you take responsibility for the chaos you've caused? Harry leaned forward now, elbows resting on his knees. Do you want responsibility? Fine, I take it, for speaking out, for breaking the cycle, for refusing to pass the pain I inherited to my children. That's the responsibility I chose. The audience murmured again, this time louder. One woman clapped slowly. Another followed. Piers heard it and turned to them. Oh, don't start applauding now. This isn't a hero's journey, it's a PR campaign. And that was when Harry, still calm but visibly sharper, stood up. I didn't come here for your approval, Piers, he said. I came here to challenge something bigger than both of us. The machine. The one that takes a tragedy, packages it, and sells it to people hungry for distraction. Piers rolled his eyes. A machine, huh? You are the machine now, Harry. Every camera in here, every dollar made off your words. That's your machine. And it's running perfectly. That was the moment the tension snapped. Harry walked toward the edge of the set, looked directly into the lens of the main camera, and said, if I am the machine now, then I'll use it to tell people that trauma isn't gossip. And that healing doesn't come with a headline. Suddenly, a voice came over the studio speakers from the control booth. We're going to break. Stand by. But it was too late. The fire had already ignited. Piers moved to stand directly in front of Harry, as if to block the camera shot. You don't get the last word here. Security moved toward the edge of the stage. Harry didn't flinch. I'm not asking for the last word. I'm asking for the truth to be louder than the spin. A producer on the floor whispered into her headset, we need to cut the feed now. The screen faded to the show's logo for commercial, but by then, phones in the audience were already recording. The confrontation would be out in the world in minutes. And back in the dressing rooms, Meghan Markle's phone buzzed. She looked at the notification. Her eyes narrowed. She knew this wasn't just a media fight. This was about something deeper. And it had only just begun. The break had ended, but nothing felt the same. The glossy lights of the studio returned. The audience was told to settle, and producers scrambled to regain control. But the energy in the room was no longer just awkward, it was electric. No script could contain what had just happened. Piers Morgan returned from the commercial with a practiced smile, his voice tight but composed. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we're here with Prince Harry. And well, it's been enlightening. Harry sat back in his chair, calm again. But beneath the surface, something simmered. His hands were clasped tightly. His shoulders held a tension he hadn't brought in with him. Let's shift gears, shall we? Piers said, falsely lighthearted. Let's talk about legacy, about your mother. The studio fell dead silent. The name hung heavy in the air. Diana, Harry didn't move for a second. Piers leaned in. You've said before that the press played a role in her death. You've made comparisons between what happened to her and what's happening to you now. But don't you think that's a bit of a stretch? You live in a mansion in Montecito. She was chased to her death, Harry interrupted. And yes, I believe the same system is still alive. It's just changed its clothes. The audience gasped. Even the floor camera hesitated, uncertain whether to cut to a wide shot or zoom in. I was 12, Harry continued, voice steady. And I had to walk behind her coffin while cameras clicked. And now, 2 decades later, I watch grown adults weaponize her memory for headlines. Piers narrowed his eyes. That's rich, coming from someone who just signed a multi-million-dollar memoir deal. Harry didn't blink. That book wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming memory. Mine, my mother's, my family's. From people like you, who twisted it. Piers barked a laugh. People like me? You mean journalists? I mean opportunists, Harry corrected. You weren't there when she cried at night? When we had to move through back exits just to avoid flashbulbs? You don't know what it's like to live every day knowing the same cameras that took. Her dignity might one day follow my wife or my children." The crowd was quiet again, not out of boredom, but because no one dared interrupt. Backstage, producers were signaling each other. The control room debated ending the interview early, but something in the ratings feed stopped them. Viewership was skyrocketing. Piers took a deep breath, trying to reset the tone. But something in him was cracked open. His eyes flickered. Mix of resentment, maybe even guilt. "So what then?" he asked. "You just want us all to turn off the lights and walk away from the story. To ignore the royals, the scandals, the questions." Harry stared at him. "No, I want the story told without blood in the ink." It was a line rehearsed in the heart, not on paper. It struck. Even the crew stopped moving. A phone buzzed somewhere in the crowd. No one reached for it. Piers didn't speak immediately. For the first time in the interview, he seemed unsure. Then, reaching for control, he grabbed a stack of papers from his desk. "You want honesty?" he said, raising the papers. "Let's talk honesty. We've obtained an unreleased letter from your time in the military, signed by you, sent to the palace. We've had it verified. Talks about your growing discomfort with UK operations in Afghanistan." Harry's body stiffened. "You said you were afraid British troops were being used to serve American oil interests. You questioned your own mission." The audience gasped again. Harry said nothing at first. Then, softly, he replied, "I still have nightmares." "You want to talk about that too?" Piers hesitated. "Read the whole letter," Harry continued. "Read the part where I said I still loved my country even when I didn't understand it." The camera zoomed in. Piers looked down at the page, in his hands, and realized, for the first time in the show's long history, he might have gone too far. "Why are you doing this?" Harry asked suddenly. Piers looked up. "What do you mean?" Harry leaned forward. "You've made a career of breaking people down. But what happens when the story breaks you?" The room was ice. No answer came. Not from Piers, not from anyone. Outside, Twitter was ablaze. Clips, quotes, hashtags. Hashtag Harry Vespers. Hashtag Diana was right. Hashtag Truth Without Permission. Inside, the studio lights remained bright. But everything else had grown darker. The silence after Harry's last question stretched like a wire pulled tight. Piers Morgan held the letter in his hand, but didn't read further. His eyes flicked toward the producers just off camera. They didn't signal anything. It was on his own now. Harry didn't move. He was staring, not with anger, but with something quieter. Sadness, maybe, or clarity. The audience was dead still. So Piers finally said, forcing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, "We've now entered the land of moral high ground. Is that what this is?" Harry raised an eyebrow. "No. This is what happens when someone stops running from the truth." The producers were now whispering into each other's headsets. Something had shifted permanently. This wasn't just a tense interview, it was unraveling into something they couldn't edit out. Something live, raw, and permanent. Piers reached for his cup, took a sip, and set it down too quickly. The clink of porcelain echoed too loud. His voice lowered. "Do you understand how dangerous it is for someone like you, a prince, to publicly question the military, to question your own country's intentions overseas?" Harry nodded once. "I do. But I also know what's more dangerous pretending we never have." He wasn't grandstanding. He wasn't raising his voice. And that made it hit harder. Piers opened his mouth, but Harry beat him to it. "You're angry," Harry said, "because I'm not playing the part you wrote. I didn't come here to fight. I came here hoping there was still a way to speak like humans, not headlines." A few claps came from the audience, brief, uncertain. Piers's jaw tightened. He stood up suddenly, stepping away from his desk. "Oh, come on," he snapped. "You say that, but let's not forget the Netflix deal, the Oprah interview, the book tour. You've turned your grief into a brand. Harry stood to now calmly. I turned it into a shield. Because people like you kept trying to turn it into a weapon. The two men stood across from each other. No desk between them now, no jokes. Left. The stage lights were hot. One of the cameras went slightly off balance as its operator adjusted under pressure. In the control room, someone said we should cut to break. A voice replied, "Not yet. This is real." Back in the studio, Harry took a breath. Then, for the first time since arriving, he looked directly into the camera. "I know what it's like to bury the one person who protected you from the world and then be left to face it alone. I know what it's like to be used as a symbol for a system you didn't build. And I know what it costs when you finally say, enough." He turned back to Piers. "You call it betrayal. I call it survival." Security had now begun to appear just at the edge of the stage, unsure whether their presence was needed. They weren't responding to violence, there was none. But the tension had reached a level that made even seasoned professionals sweat. Piers paced, breathing hard. He wasn't yelling, but he was flushed, visibly unraveling. "This isn't about your mother anymore, Harry. This is about power. You couldn't have it inside the palace, so now you're trying to build your own kingdom in California." Harry smiled slightly. "You think this is about crowns? It's about children growing up in peace. It's about men not dying for politics. About truth being told even when it's not convenient." Piers pointed toward the camera. "You want the truth told? Then tell us everything, not just your edited version. Tell us what really happened between you and your brother. Tell us about your father. What did the Queen really say before she died? That crossed a line." Gasps came from the crowd. Even the camera crew turned, stunned. Harry's face went still. He didn't flinch, didn't shout, but his voice dropped into something icy. "You bring up my grandmother like she was a tool. In your ratings game, you don't care what she said. Care what sells." Security stepped in now, not because of threat, but because it was clearly time. Harry nodded to the guard who approached. "It's all right. I was leaving anyway." He turned to the audience. "Thanks for listening." He didn't say goodbye to Piers. He didn't need to. As he exited the frame, the studio was silent, again except for Piers, who stood alone on stage holding a stack of questions that no longer mattered. The broadcast feed didn't cut. It stayed live. For a few seconds too long, the audience stared at the empty chair, where a prince had sat and told the kind of truth that doesn't need permission. Outside, the world was already reacting. Tweets flew. Screenshots spread. The story wasn't over. It had just begun. The door behind the set closed with a soft thud as Prince Harry disappeared into the corridor. The moment he left the stage, the crew and security let out a collective breath, like air finally returning to a vacuum. In the control room, producers scrambled, speaking over one another. "Do we run a statement? Do we cut the final segment?" "No, let it ride. Everyone's watching now." Backstage, Harry walked briskly, but not in anger. There was a calm around him, the kind of calm that comes after choosing not to be silent. One of the younger producers rushed beside him, holding out a phone. "There's already a clip trending on X. You're #1 worldwide." Harry barely looked. Of course it is. Back inside the studio, Piers Morgan was still at the desk, but the energy had changed. The smugness had drained from his face, replaced by a cold calculation. He looked straight at the camera and addressed the audience. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, what you just witnessed wasn't planned, but it was real now. And whether you love him or loathe him, Prince Harry showed us tonight that the line between privacy and publicity is thinner than ever." There was a pause. No one clapped. Piers glanced off camera. The teleprompter was blank. The crew had stopped feeding him scripts. For once, he was unscripted too. "He calls it truth," he muttered. I call it branding. Then, with no more to say, the feed finally cut. Meanwhile, Harry stood in a quiet room, the green room, now dim and empty. A bottle of untouched water sat on the table. He reached for it, then changed his mind. Instead, he looked at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. No crown, no military uniform, no press handlers in sight. He was just Harry. His phone buzzed. A text from Megan. You did it your way. Come home. But there were more messages. Two, some angry, some sympathetic, and one unexpected from a senior intelligence officer who had once served under his mother's security team. It read, "What you said about Africa wasn't wrong. Call me." He read it twice. Outside, a crowd had already gathered near the exit. Reporters, cameras, and flashing lights. They were waiting, but Harry didn't rush out. He sat down, leaned forward, and closed his eyes. He thought about what Piers had said, that he was trying to build a kingdom in California. But it wasn't about kingdoms. It never was. He had seen the underside of institutions. He knew what silence had cost his mother. He knew how power spoke behind closed doors, how narratives were crafted, and how a smile in front of a camera could hide 100 lies. Back on the studio floor, the audience was being ushered out. They left quietly, most still whispering about what they had just witnessed. A few stared at the stage, as if expecting Harry to return. But he wouldn't. One audience member, a middle-aged woman in a red scarf, was overheard saying, "He didn't yell, didn't accuse, but he made me believe him." That clip, too, went viral. The network scrambled to control the fallout. Statements were being drafted, spin teams activated. Some called it a breakdown, others a breakthrough. And somewhere across the Atlantic, in the halls of power, old advisors began to make phone calls. Because when a royal speaks out, it's news. But when one doesn't back down, it becomes something more. A ripple, a warning, a shift. By midnight, global headlines had shifted. Prince Harry challenges media power live. Clash on Piers Morgan's show sparks international debate, truth versus narrative. A prince breaks the mold, but Harry didn't care about the headlines anymore. What mattered was what came next. He opened his phone again, scrolled past the noise, found the number in the text, dialed. It rang twice. A voice answered, deep and direct. "Mr. Windsor, we've been waiting for you to stop playing nice." Harry exhaled slowly. "I'm ready." And just like that, the interview that started as entertainment had shifted the axis of a much deeper story, one that hadn't been told yet, but would be very soon. The car pulled away from the studio, its tinted windows shielding Prince Harry from the swarm of photographers still gathered outside. Inside, the silence was thick. No aides, no publicists. Just Harry, seated in the back seat, watching the city blur past. His face was calm, but his mind raced. Across London, headlines were lighting up every major news outlet. Security called after Piers Morgan meltdown. Prince Harry walks out live on air. Did we just watch the monarchy clash with modern media? The clips had already gone viral. His last words, "I won't apologize for surviving what others profit from," were being replayed on loop. But beyond the noise, Harry knew something deeper had shifted. What happened in that studio wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was the surface crack of something more, a confrontation between legacy power and a changing narrative, one that no longer bowed. He checked his phone. It's a dozen missed calls, one from a restricted number, other from an old friend in the British Army, a third from Meghan. He opened her message first. "Whatever they spin, the world saw your truth. Tonight, Proud doesn't even begin to cover it." He smiled slightly. Then his phone rang again. Same restricted number. This time he answered. A voice clipped. "British, older, you've drawn attention. Not all of it friendly." Harry leaned back. "Let them watch." There was a pause on the line. "Then there are people inside. The system still. Ones who remember Diana. Ones who know the cost of silence. You want to do more than walk off a stage, you'll need to come further into the fire. Harry didn't speak right away. He remembered the days when everything was scripted, every handshake, every word. That world was gone. Or maybe it had never been real. I don't want to burn it down, he said finally. I want to drag it into the light. The voice replied, then you'll need protection. Harry ended the call without replying. Not out of arrogance, but because he understood the price of what came next. The lines were no longer drawn between royal and commoner, between monarchy and republic. They were drawn between those who built their legacy on truth and those who built it on control. Back in the studio, Piers Morgan sat alone in the green room. His hands trembled slightly as he watched the playback on a monitor. His own outburst, his loss of control. The moment security stepped between them, he hadn't expected Harry to hold his ground. He hadn't expected the backlash either. A producer entered the room. We've been asked to pull the episode from streaming. Piers looked up sharply. By who? Legal? And 2 sponsors. He laughed bitterly. Truth costs more than fiction, doesn't it? But even he wasn't sure if it was a joke. Across the ocean in Washington, D.C., 2 analysts at a media watch firm flagged this segment as potentially destabilizing, linking it to rising online conversations about government surveillance, media manipulation, and royal immunity. A report was sent quietly to a government liaison in the UK. Meanwhile, Harry arrived at a private apartment near Kensington, greeted by 2 plainclothes men he didn't recognize. Security one said simply, "Your team requested backup." Harry said nothing but allowed them in. That night, he stood by the window, watching the fog settle over London. Below, the city moved on fast and unaware. But he knew better now. This wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. He wasn't just a prince anymore. He was something else. A disruptor. A witness. A man no longer willing to be written by others. And far from the cameras from Piers Morgan's studio. From the polished battleground of television, Prince Harry finally understood that, to reclaim the story, you sometimes had to walk off the stage. But then you had to write the next one yourself.